BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Caz Graham and this is the Farming Today podcast. Welcome. In this episode, we're talking intensive farming. We're off to Yorkshire and a farm that fattens 4,000 cattle each year for beef, and we look at the pros and cons of large-scale farms that use intensive methods.
Because those animals grow faster there on the planet for a shorter amount of time, the carbon footprint tends to be lower. But of course, if they're housed inside, they can't be having the positive impacts on biodiversity, for example, that we'd see with a pasture-based system.
More on that a little later. First, though, the Northern Ireland government has launched its first food strategy framework. Its aims include tackling diet-related health problems, increasing resilience in the agri-food supply chain, building the food economy and creating more of a food culture in Northern Ireland. An action plan will follow early next year, setting out what changes the government will make to meet those aims. Northern Ireland's Minister for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, Andrew Muir, told me it will be good for farmers.
So I think this is absolutely really positive news for farmers, because what we're seeing in terms of retailers and also processors is this is what they're looking for. They're looking for these better health and sustainable outcomes, and that's what we can deliver this through the food strategy framework.
I mean, in the section you have about resilient supply chains, it mentions creating shorter supply chains. How do you actually make that happen when so much power is in the hands of the big retailers?
So we are very conscious of that. And very conscious of that power imbalance. And I want to work with the DEFRA Secretary and my colleagues in Scotland and Wales to address that, because we want to be able to shorten those supply chains, but we want to do it in a fair and equitable manner.
Yeah, how are you going to do it, though? It's a massive nut to crack, isn't it?
Yes, and I am very aware now that the honeymoon as Minister is well and truly over, and I'm now getting into the very meaty issues here, and one of which is around that supply chain and those issues, and that's where I need to work with the UK government on this as well in terms of that power imbalance.
The strategy also talks about building a food-conscious society. Does that mean valuing food more? And does that mean actually paying a bit more for food?
I think it's actually about looking at the food we eat, and also we can make more informed choices around that. This is not about dictating to people around things. It's about more education and awareness around it. The top priority in it is about the right to food. And I think that is absolutely key, because visiting local food banks, we're very conscious that in a Western society it is a real shame that we have people who are unable to feed their families, and that's something I want to work through with my executive college to be able to address that.
How confident are you, though, that it will make any difference? Henry Dimbleby wrote the National Food Strategy for the UK government, but to be honest, much of it was ignored.
So what requires is leadership on this, and I'm determined to give that as Minister and to drive this forward, because this is a key issue within our society in terms of the ability to have nutritious, healthy food, but also sustainability.
Andrew Muir, Northern Ireland's Minister for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs. Now, how many cattle would you expect to find on a farm? 100? 200? Well, BBC research recently found that there are currently almost 950 farm operations in the UK with more than 700 dairy or beef cattle. There's a global trend for farms to scale up and intensify their production, and the UK is no different. We're talking intensive farming all this week on the programme, and in a couple of minutes we're going to hear more about why it's happening and the impact it's having. But first, let's hear from a Yorkshire farmer who fattens 4,000 cattle a year in pens. He reckons with this intensive system he can produce beef more efficiently and in half the time of extensively grazed systems. Sarah Falkingham has been to see Doug Deer on his farm near Selby in North Yorkshire.
We're just moving some cattle now because we're going to muck a pen out. These won't be far off going to the processor.
So these beasts are just walking past us here, having a bit of a stretch of the legs. And behind them are the really large farm sheds, mostly open-sided for the ventilation. And within them, you've got about 1,600 cattle here.
1,600 cattle on farm, building up the pen size now to hold 120 cattle apiece of one customer's.
I can see some rations here just in a row outside where they stick their heads through the grate. What's that a mix of?
So basically we're on 75 to 80% homegrown produce, so there's wheat, barley, straw, forage maize in there, crimped maize on occasion, fodder beet, and then the remainder of the ration is made up of co-products. We're using dark distillers grains from the alcohol industry, wheat syrup again from the alcohol industry, out-of-spec potatoes, and surplus bread and Yorkshire puddings.
Yorkshire puddings for Yorkshire cattle, right.
Yeah.
So it's not come from most of this feed, and no imported soya.
No, not allowed to use soya, and we haven't used soya for probably 10 years now.
The lifespan of these cattle is about maybe half what it would be up on a hill, and that cuts down methane emissions. But if you take the cereal production carbon emissions, where do you stand there on the whole carbon footprint of these animals?
Well, obviously we're growing cereals on our own land, and all the muck is being recycled back through the cereals, so we're not using, we're way down on stats for nitrogen. We haven't put any P&K on the farm in the last 20 years, I would say. So it's majorly efficient. We're using the product to grow cereals at the cheapest price.
People coming here might expect to see, the cattle outside. Some of these cattle have been outside. They've had a summer outside on grass.
Yeah.
Some haven't.
Yeah.
Is it better for the animals to be inside from a welfare point of view?
Well, as you can see, they've got the choice because we've got big yards. They can either stand outside in the front of the open yard or go under the shed when either it's too hot or it's, inclement weather. I can't see any problem with cattle being housed inside for the last 90 to 120 days of their life. There's not a problem in it, and it's probably the most efficient way of feeding the cattle because we can get this high starch protein diet into them, which will give them the correct cover so that we get the eating quality out of the beef.
A lot of these animals have come from dairy herds. We have to say that those unwanted male calves are becoming more of a thing of a past.
If you've got a certain milk contracts, obviously you're not allowed to shoot bobby calves, and rightly so. So we've now, as an industry, we're either going dual purpose breeds, Fleck Vey or Montbéliard, and then crossing those back to the Angus and providing a really good beef animal, or some of the dairy herd is producing Wagyu, which is another outlet for beef. I would say there's hardly any, if any, bobby calves shot at all now.
Do you think this is the future then? More indoor housing, less extensive grazing?
There's always a place for grass in the life cycle of cattle because obviously we need to grow the frame so that we can hang the meat on it, but if you want to actually get the cover on the animal, they're going to have to come inside at some point in their lifetime and be fed a high starch diet to hit the supermarket spec.
Farmer Doug Deere talking to Sarah Falkingham. So what exactly is intensive farming? Jude Capper is Professor of Sustainable Beef and Sheep Production at Harper Adams University.
Intensive farming's a difficult one because it's quite an emotive subject, so it tends to mean different things to different people. But it generally means housed livestock, finishing or getting to their slaughter weight in a relatively shorter time compared to more extensive systems out on pasture and grassland. In the UK and indeed across the globe, we've seen a growing trend towards bigger farms, more consolidated farms. We've got fewer, total farms across the UK and across the world. And that's often because of efficiencies, economies of scale, older people going out of business and their farms being bought up by bigger farms. But I think it's really important to understand that big doesn't mean bad, as it were.
OK, because, people often worry about whether things like animal welfare suffers on intensive farms, particularly where, say, livestock lives indoors all year round. Is there any basis for those worries?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And welfare really is the only bit that we don't know all the answers to yet. There's quite a lot of data out there that shows that it depends what the animal's used to. If the animal hasn't ever been outside, it doesn't necessarily want to go outside. And there's been some really interesting work in broiler chickens, for example, to show that if you give them access, often they don't actually want it. And we've shown the same in dairy cattle at Harper Adams.
But people also worry, though, that if you have, say, 1,500 cattle in a shed, you're less likely to notice if there's something up with them than if you had, say, 50 cattle in a shed.
Yeah, absolutely. If we've got more animals in the same space, then it's going to be more difficult to see every individual characteristic of every single animal. But I'd argue that generally speaking, when we have a bigger farm, when we have the capacity to have more staff and to have more staff doing specialised things, so person A looks after the calves, person B looks after the feed, person C looks after the milking or the breeding, let's say, then we've got that capacity to look at every animal. Whereas if you've got a relatively smaller farm with, say, 2 people trying to look after 200 livestock, it's less easy to catch every single change in every animal.
The push for intensification, though, it has led to things like the so-called kind of Franken chicken, a chicken that grows much faster than other chickens. And animal welfare campaigners would argue it can suffer from pain in its legs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have to be honest in the animal industry that we haven't always necessarily done all the right things. And if we go too far pushing for one single thing, so let's say growth rate in poultry or milk yield in cattle, we can have negative trade-offs and negative consequences. Ultimately, if we want a sustainable food system, we've got to look for really good health and welfare as well as productivity going forwards.
What impact does intensification, keeping animals indoors, have on carbon emissions and other environmental impacts like, say, biodiversity?
That's a really good question. On average, and I am saying on average, intensive systems tend to have a lower carbon footprint because those animals grow faster, they're on the planet for a shorter amount of time. The carbon footprint and the resource use, so land, water, fertilisers, etc., tends to be lower. But of course, if they're housed inside, they can't be having the positive impacts on biodiversity, for example, soil quality, soil health, that we'd see with a pasture-based system. So we've got this dichotomy between what do we care about more? Is it carbon footprint? Is it biodiversity? Is it landscape maintenance? It sort of almost comes down to what does the consumer value most? And indeed, of course, what does the processor and government value most as well?
Professor Jude Capper, and we'll be exploring all sorts of intensive farming systems throughout this week. But that's it from us for today. I'm Caz Graham. The producer is Heather Simons, and Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.